Namaste, everyone. Welcome to the Charvak podcast. Time to discuss another book. And let me tell you, it's an absolute honor because today we have with us on the podcast Dr. Arvind Panagaria. Dr. Panagaria, thanks a lot for coming on the podcast.
Thank you, Kushal. Very pleased to be on your podcast. I've been
So,
following your podcast for a while, so not all of them, but I off and on. So
it's actually an honor that you've been following my podcast because I'm a fan of your work and I've been reading your work, watching you on television for years now. So it's actually an honor for me. So today, obviously, the subject for discussion is Dr. Panagaria's latest book, and I'll just give you an idea, guys, about the format today. Today, it's more than a podcast; it's like a digital roundtable. As you know, we have with us two of my friends who have been regulars on the podcast. Hi, Harsh and Rajiv. So
Hi.
this is how we're going to do it, guys. I'm going to start. Maybe I'll ask a couple of questions, and obviously then Harsh and Rajiv, because all three of us have read Professor Panagaria's book, and we want to ask different questions and touch on different topics. So we were like, let us create this digital roundtable so that we can cover all the aspects. Because obviously, I might have a few questions, but Harsh can look at it in a different way, and Rajiv can look at it in another way. And not only that, if you guys have any questions later on, I'm very open about it. You can ask the questions on the live chat, and I'll ask them to Dr. Panagaria too. So before we get into the specific discussion of the book, sir, I wanted to start by asking you this question. You've written two books previously which were in similar lines. So what was in your mind when you decided, okay, I need to revisit this subject and I need to rewrite, making a few points again? So what was going through your head that made you write this book again?
So for people like me who are at a public policy school at a major university in the United States, there is more than one objective in writing our scholarly books. So I do see this as a scholarly book. So that certainly is part of it. But we also try to carry our message to both the larger public and the government of the day. When you're trying to address those audiences, you need some contemporary connect. And the last book I did was Why Growth Matters, which was in 2012. There's a little bit different, actually. Quite a bit of that book was on the historical developments soon after the independence, bringing us to the 2012, around that period. So we went through a lot of the debates that had happened during particularly Indira Gandhi's period. Whereas the India, the Emerging Giant, the book that preceded even Why Growth Matters in 2008, was about bringing together various areas of policy, from education to telecommunication to railways to poverty issues. It was very wide ranging, so that was my first really serious book on India, and that was much more wide ranging. Now this book actually first of all wants to cast the policy in the current context, and so therefore tries to come all the way to UPA 2, where the Modi government then takes charge, and it covers the first 5 years of the Modi government as well. But more than that, this is a very focused attempt at a package of reforms that would create the well-paid, decent jobs for the large population or large workforce that India has. The unique thing here is that, look, much of our workforce does not have enough skills. What we are talking about is people who are currently in farming, people who are working in jobs, self-employed, very large proportion, and so forth. So these people need really to get out of their subsistence level of existence and have jobs that are well paid. So this is a book very integrated in its approach. I did not, I was, for example, very aware of the fact that health and education are two extremely important areas for India, but I did not go into those. This book was about creating good jobs and therefore also reinforcing the growth process. launching India into something like 8 to 10% growth for about 2 decades. How India can do in the next 20 years, what China did in the last 20 years. So that was the kind of motivation. And so this is a very integrated, holistic kind of set of economic reforms that the book lays out. And so, also one thing which I often say, that in public policy, repetition is a virtue, not a vice. You don't always get heard in the first time that you say something. You have to say it again, and you have to say it again. So that is also to some degree behind writing a third book.
All right. So, guys, I wanted to start by asking Professor Panagaria the first question. So, after that, Rajiv and Harsh, you guys can come in. So, sir, while I was reading this book, this one part really, hit me because it was about textiles, and I'm a textile entrepreneur, and I got immediately attracted to it. So even in the email exchange, like सबसे पहली चीज मैंने राजीव हर्ष को बोली थी, I'm asking this question to Dr. Panagaria because I'm the textile guy, so I claim rights first. So in the book, you have spoken about how, let's say, and this is a perfect time to discuss this. We are living in the I won't say the post-COVID world. We are living in right now. We're right smack bang inside the pandemic. But a lot of discussion is happening. A lot of people across the world are now talking about maybe slowly, taking their manufacturing away from in a lot of industries to other parts of the world. Now, apparel was something you used as a very specific example in the book, and you went about and gave a comparison. Obviously, it was about a larger comparison of how much of our workforce is actually involved in agriculture and industries. So now I would request you to actually elaborate on that point, and why do you think apparel per se and many more such industries, why are they that important, and why do we need to focus on them?
Okay, so it's a very good question. It really is a part of the central theme of the book. So I'm very pleased you started me off on that question. So there's a little bit of background, to why I think apparel is so important. Now, if you look at the Indian economy and ask where are my workers, so about 44%, based on the 2017-18 survey, the large PLFS survey, Periodic Labor Force Survey, 44% are in agriculture. Now, the problem is compounded by the fact that about half of India's agricultural holdings, 48% to be precise, 70 million in absolute number land holdings are less than half hectare, with an average size of just less than a quarter hectare. These are very tiny, small little holdings. Nobody can make a full living. Actually, I do some numbers, and you can't even get poverty level of per capita expenditure for a family of 5 on such a small holding. These workers, no matter what we do. So I'm very pleased right now the Prime Minister, Finance Minister announced a package of reforms in agriculture. Those are all very long awaited. I'm very pleased that finally, the government showed the courage to do it. But no matter what we do there is no easy way for these people to get to an acceptable living standard with any reforms within agriculture. They have to move out, meaning that even if you double or even if you triple their income, which is not easy in agriculture. It just is not easy in agriculture to triple your incomes, because by nature, agriculture, the best it does is 4 to 5%. That doesn't, move fast enough. So you have to move these workers out of agriculture into industry and services. Similarly, a very large part of our workforce, even in industry and services, in these very tiny little enterprises, micro little, even many of these are what we call the own account enterprises, which do not employ a single worker as a regular kind of hired worker. So these are also self-employment kind of employments, and very, very low value added in these enterprises. So again, these people are not in decent jobs. They're at most in subsistence level of jobs. We need good jobs. We need jobs that will pay, at least some sort of decent wage. This is where the apparel industry in particular, in India we call it textiles, but perhaps to be very specific, because what the rest of the world calls textiles, which is cloth and the like, that's more mechanized. That is now very capital intensive. When I was young, even textiles was very labor intensive, but no more. But clothing, apparel, ready-made, what we may call ready-made garments, that industry is still highly labor intensive. And beauty of it is, I've talked to people like Shahi Exports, which is our largest exporter in India, Mr. Ahuja. He tells me that in his factories he is able to train these workers in 6 weeks if they have about 5th grade level of education, which most youngsters nowadays coming whether from rural areas or urban areas have that. They can train them in 6 weeks. Now, apparel global market is very large. Total export market is easily $700 to $800 billion. It's not million, it's $700 to $800 billion. China alone exports some $150 billion worth of. It used to 180. Now, gradually it is shrinking because other countries are coming upstream. So Vietnam has expanded quite a bit. Bangladesh has expanded quite a bit. We have not expanded much at all. We are still below 20 billion, and for our size, we are extremely small. So I think this is a big, huge opportunity for us. Wages in China are rising. A lot of these factories are looking for better places. We ought to bring them to our shores, because what we need to do also is to change the ecosystem within our own country, and bringing in export-oriented firms into the country, or encouraging our own also to become exporters in the global markets. That's what brings in technological change. That's what brings in quality. Because when you have to compete against the best in the world, that is when you do the best. And new technology comes in, new capital comes in, management practices come in, and all that multinationals can bring to you as a package. And this is why hooking up into the export market is very important. Timing is also doubly good, you see, because now the center of gravity of the global economy is rapidly shifting into Asia. And there's going to be huge demand in Asia. Whatever China was exporting to the United States or Europe in the previous 20 years, similar demand is going to now come into Asia in a big way. So it's going to be a big market, and we are talking about RCEP and free trade agreements and so forth. So that is where I think the action is. So apparel, of course, is the big labor-intensive industry, but I also think of footwear, furniture, a lot of the everyday items that we use, things like umbrellas, stationery, kitchenware, so many things we use in everyday life, which are generally still labor intensive, assembly activities, and of course electronics industry as well. That's another way where good jobs can be created, although that requires a little bit more skill. So that is the pitch of the book. That's what we need to do.
So just to ask one quick question, Professor. We have seen Bangladesh's massive success in the garment industry, and that did have something to do with trade agreements with EU in particular.
Yes.
So just wanted to understand that better. So what did Bangladesh get it right in terms of its trade negotiations? Why are we in India not able to get similar kinds of trade agreements in place? If you can expound and enlighten us on that.
Yeah. So Rajiv, you took the specific example of Bangladesh. There, actually, Bangladesh really doesn't have a trade agreement with the European Union, but
Okay.
it gets classified as a least developed country. And European Union happens to have something called the Everything But Arms Initiative for the least developed countries.
Okay.
So under that initiative, it allows duty-free entry of everything except the arms from the least developed countries. And
Okay.
Bangladesh has, as a result, benefited big time from that. But I think there is something that we can learn from Bangladesh, which is that Bangladesh has had very, very flexible labor laws. And we have, that has been one of our major self-inflicted wounds. And long back, I think, one author I remember wrote back and said, this is, somebody writing in the 1960s, that, in India, we have tried to bring the social revolution before the economic revolution. Most countries do it the other way around. That, in the end, the social revolution has to follow economic revolution. Social in this sense of, that giving very high level of protection to workers, very high level of protection, even to environment, really, we have started a lot earlier, at least making the efforts. Most countries, initially, when you go back to Japan, when it's industrialized even in the post-Second World War era, I remember a very famous Japanese economist who used to tell me that, in the 60s, when we sort of smelled the smoke, it was a sense of pride for us that we were industrializing, that this was, so very different way of looking at things. But, what we did was to borrow these labor laws from the Western countries, the Great Britain, really, pretty much some of the laws were already written out when the British were ruling in India. The Industrial Disputes Act is also 1948. So it really, anybody who wrote it was very heavily British educated. So they basically, took that in and copied that law from the UK to India. But the conditions were very different for India. And, one of the difficulties with these laws is that, once you put in place, it's very difficult to change those, because, you can't be seen, for the politician, it's very hard to be seen as being against workers. You're not being against workers when you're being for workers, when you liberalize some of the labor laws, at least, because it's an issue of whether I protect the workers at a very high level, those workers that already have jobs, and then shut out additional employment for the other workers who are looking for jobs, versus having a more reasonable set of labor laws, which would also balance the rights of the workers and rights of the employers, so that they will hire more workers. You see, so what has happened in India really is that if you look at the formal sector, employment is hardly kind of expanded. It really remains very, very low. I was giving you the numbers: 44% in agriculture. Another 42% of Indian workers are in companies that are less than 20 workers. Now, and many of these are self-employment type of workers also. Right. So there is your 86% of the workforce. Only 9% we know recorded. 9% are in companies with more than 20 workers. And, more than 20 workers is not a large scale. Companies that are less than 50 workers, highly unlikely that they will be operating in the export markets. They are serving local markets, and therefore generally paying wages that are subsistence level or slightly better. So, right. You see, so we need, and Bangladesh actually saw it, and Bangladesh had much more flexible labor laws.
That would probably be one of the biggest learnings we can take from them, that absolutely. This should probably be done as soon as possible.
Absolutely, yeah. So unfortunately, you see, this is also a concurrent list subject, and being a bit contentious. Also, I think, the institutions like the International Labour Organizations really sit on the heads of our labor ministry. But the labor ministry has to act independent, the national interest. They don't have to be catering to the pleadings of the International Labour Organization, right? At the end of the day, can the ILO dictate the United States any labor policies? They will not even let them enter through their doors. So why do we have to, so we should do what is in our national interest. But you see, so the center thinks, well, let the states do it. States are not often willing to do things that the center that contradict what the center is doing, and so the whole thing falls through. And unfortunately, what the UP and Gujarat did, that was too drastic. Meaning that suspend all the labor laws except 3 for a limited period of time. But that I think goes too far. I mean, you really can't. Workers have to have the right to, or some right to dispute resolution. They have to have the right to be members of the trade unions. They have to have, under reasonable circumstances, if they want to
health and safety.
Strike, health and safety. So you have to have the balance. You can't, So we know this, that central government is very unlikely to give the approval to these labor law reforms that Gujarat and UP have proposed. So it's a sort of sad thing, because if clearly the 2 states had the courage, well, so if they had done a little more harder work and offered amendments to the existing legislations that would strike a better balance between the rights of the employees and employers, that I think would have been approved by the central government. I mean, some of the more reasonable reforms in the past that Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, I think even Haryana and Gujarat, they were approved. And the present government, in fact, is very much reform oriented. In the current environment, in fact, the Prime Minister himself actually was telling the chief ministers that you guys should do some labor law reforms. I remember one of the participants actually who on a public television said so, that the Prime Minister had been prompting them to do labor law reforms. So I think it's a good time, but if the states will do a little more careful work and would offer good kind of amendments to the existing legislations, I think there is a lot of appetite for those reforms to go through.
So, sir, I actually just wanted to make a comment before I let Harsh come in. So on the textiles bit, I think one more point that people need to realize is that the difference between India and Bangladesh in the textiles, as my experience as being now in the industry for 20 years, is actually the only factor has been the cost factor. There's actually no other factor that a lot of things have gone into Bangladesh, because in terms of quality, I don't see India and Bangladesh really having any kind of a difference. It's only the labor price, and basically which leads into a lot of cascading effects. From my experience, a lot of manufacturers tend to go to Bangladesh. But anyways, we can touch upon it, because somebody on the super chat has also asked this question, so we'll address this later on. Harsh, you wanted to come in?
No, absolutely. I think there was an excellent discussion, sir, on labor laws. I think for some of our viewers to understand, I think you were also briefly advising Rajasthan government on some of those laws, right? And which was the first step which happened. And I went through the book. I think it's an excellent book. There is one very good section on migrant labor also, so to speak, which is a lot in the news these days.
Yes.
And you've covered which cities have more slums and so on and so forth.
Right.
My question, sir, was based on one chapter of your book and also based on some recent interviews you've given. And it's actually the only area where you are criticizing somewhat the government, and where the government is somewhat not listening to your suggestions. I think the other areas, you would say normatively they're agreeing with you. They may not be implementing it fast enough, but there is no as such disagreement, I would say. There is more of a bureaucratic delay. So that area is obviously trade policy. And I think in the recent times was you, along with, I think together or separately with Jeffrey Sachs, gave a couple of interviews saying that we should have India, for example, missed out an opportunity by not joining the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. For the viewers, it is if India joins the 16-country trade agreement, India, ASEAN, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. So I just want to briefly lay out. I'm very confused on this issue, and I understand both the points, and I just want to lay out my doubts so that you can answer and give your point of view. I think on one point, obviously, the classical free trade case is obvious, right? More efficiencies, economies of scale, domestic producers not being inefficient, and so on and so forth, and consumers benefiting. I think on the other hand, there is the infant industry argument, which you've dealt not only in this book, but in another book of yours, the book before this, in which you mentioned how free trade is excellent for emerging markets, especially. So in this world of COVID-19, where there is not just economics, there's also geopolitics about China. And obviously the biggest economy in the center of RCEP is China. And, so how do we think about it? Because, for example, the Chinese economy is 5 times larger than ours, and its manufacturing sector as a percentage of the economy is around 2 times. So let us say that industrial sector is about roughly, give or take, 10 times our size. And therefore, whatever the other economies of scale they have, so for example, I'm just going through Google News. If you just do India anti-dumping duties, these days you get a lot of news, right? So there is one on carbon black. The government said they will put one on carbon black. Carbon black, as a lot of people may know, goes into tires, right? There's similarly on stainless steel products, which is already approved. Now, in a lot of these sectors, and because I am an investor by profession, and therefore I actually see a lot of these companies as well, there's a lot of spare capacity. So there was a lot of capex done in a previous boom, or there was some, and it's not being fully utilized right now. RBI data also shows that industry utilization is around 70%. Chemicals is another sector where there are anti-dumping duties being put on specialty chemicals. Again, the direct competition with China. So how do we think about, because capacity utilization, if we don't do that, we don't get new capex, and China can, kind of so-called dump. And even leaving aside geopolitics, even if we have to join, how do we, because Australia and Japan both have a trade surplus with China. We have a $60 to $65 billion trade deficit with China, and we have a new regional war with them in Ladakh, and they're giving nuclear weapons to Pakistan, and so on and so forth. So help us think, and then I'll maybe have a follow-up question, clarification on the doubts, but help us think how to think about, because I think a trade agreement with EU and US makes complete sense right now. But RCEP especially, because that is the one which people get, I think is more controversial.
Very good question, Harsh. When very well put also all the different aspects of the problem. So it is no doubt, you made a very good case that this is a very complicated question. But nevertheless, let me try to sort of unpack this one by one. First of all, the geopolitical. I think we do have a problem with China, and that will remain there. I don't think we'll settle the border issue anytime soon, if ever. But I think that is a separate issue we should deal with separately. We should not let this necessarily spill over into our economic relationship with China. Because, as I said, that's something that is going to be with us. But because of that, so are we going to manage that? Or we are going to stop trading with China or engaging with China on everything else while that problem remains? I think if I put it in these dramatic kind of terms, the answer is self-evident that we can't stop engaging with China on other issues because there is the border issue. And in any case, we are neither side wants a war with the other. China knows that we are no pushover anymore. This 1962 is not what will repeat. Something else will happen if they were to go on war with us this time. So I don't think China wants a war, and China has too many fires all around the world these days. So I don't think they are, and we certainly have no intentions. We are not an expansionist kind of power. So I think we can manage that diplomatically. We should stay there. We are building our alliances beautifully. I think, Prime Minister has really kind of changed the entire framework of alliance making, or, at least making up the international relations. I won't say alliance. Alliances is not what he's forging quite wisely, but he's, creating a network of friendships around the world. And so I think we are well protected on those areas. So I think we should try to, even if occasionally this will spill over, I have no doubt that foreign policy and international trade policy will occasionally kind of intersect, and you will take cross actions. If something happens on the foreign policy side, we will react to it on the economic side. That'll happen. That's fine. I mean, anti-dumping duties, occasional tariff raises, etc. Fine, that'll happen. But broad framework still ought to be for us to engage international trade-wise with China. So that's my first point. Now, mention things like, well, their industry or manufacturing is manifold of what is Indian manufacturing and so forth. That gets back to this infant industry kind of stuff and all, with which I simply, there's a lot of problem with the argument itself. But at the practical level, just think what China did 20 years ago. I mean, it went for the world markets and it took over. I mean, you go back, and at that time, if you go back even to 1999, 2000, the global trade, merchandise trade was about 6 billion and services trade was maybe another couple of billion or something, not even that, probably. Oh, sorry, trillion. This is all trillion. So 6 trillion was the global trade, and one in merchandise and another trillion in services. Today, $17 trillion, or 19 actually, the last figure that I've checked was 19 trillion in merchandise trade and another 6 in services, $25 trillion. Go for that market. It's a large market, Now that's the second point, that, and if Korea had worried about these things in 1960s, Taiwan had worried about this, that, how can I compete against America? How can I compete against Europeans, the British and so forth? They would have gotten nowhere. Singapore, tiny, Hong Kong, I mean, they're all free trade. Hong Kong was complete free trade, they took on to the global economy. Don't forget Mexico, when 1994 they signed off the free trade agreement with the United States. Here was a big giant economy next door. They opened up. So I think one needs the courage on that. Now, third point you make about this, how do we compete? Now, remember, let us not fall into a mistake that we made in the 1950s. We, meaning not only India, but every other country did. Except that, some of these East Asian countries got out of it by 1960s and we persisted, which was to think that industry is a monolith, that, either you import industry or you export industry. And then, of course, you knew that you couldn't be the exporters of industry and therefore you'll be importers. That's not how the Koreans and Taiwanese actually succeeded. They said, well, industry is not a monolith. It has many different sectors. There are these labor-intensive sectors where, boom, I have a big cost advantage. I can take over the global markets. Not take over. They were so small that they didn't have to take over, but they just needed a small slice of the global economy in those products. And so Korea, one of my favorite examples is, people say that Korea somehow, did import substitution and all. That's all much later, for a short period, early 70s. But before that, there's a 10-year period during which Korea was, basically a neutral trade regime, relatively liberal, and nobody knew. And before they knew, within 7 or 8 years, human hair became a major export. 10% of Korean exports were coming from human hair. They started exporting these wigs to the Americans. So, once you open up, you don't know. Entrepreneurs figure it out. The government should never try to figure it out. This is one of the problems. Our ministries want to draw up a list of everything, that these are the industries that will do well. Do good policies. Let the entrepreneurs figure out what is the right things to produce, what are the right things to export, and what are the right things to sell in the domestic market. Put good laws in place. I'm not even saying, and freer trade is an extremely important part of that good set of policies. One thing it does is, if you're committed to free trade, or at least, very low level of protection, if you're committed to it, it forces you to then fix your other policies. Then you ask the question that, look, on trade side, I'm not disadvantaging anybody. My trade regime is neutral. And if I'm not exporting what I ought to be exporting, things like very labor-intensive products, given the fact that I've got about 450 to 500 million workers here, all with very low levels of skills, or most of them with very low levels of skills. Why am I not exporting these products? Then you ask the question, and then you say, okay, I need to fix labor laws. I need to fix the land laws. My land is overly expensive. My electricity is overly expensive for the industry. I need to fix that. So I think number of these domestic policies, then you get much better focused. But if you each time say that, oh, my industry has got a disability, This is how we have proceeded, by the way. And for example, in electronics industry, the cell phones and so forth. And so we said, oh, there is a 10% disability of production in India. So I'm going to introduce 10% protection. Well, fine, you will create some small scale manufacturers who will assemble these products and sell in the domestic market. But how far will the domestic market take you? I mean, altogether, if you add up, electronics consumption in India, it's probably no more than 50-60 billion. Global market in electronics is probably closer to $1 trillion. We have done that with our auto industry. We have protected it with 125% tariff. What is happening? It grow. I mean, you'll get growth because nobody else can compete, and other better industries were creating income. So as those industries were creating income, demand for automobiles went up, and so the domestic automobile industry and even the foreign guys came and located with very tiny little plants into India. But did they become competitive? They have not even been able to get 1% share in the global exports of automobiles, and they give us automobiles in India at 1.5 times the price that the same automobile sells for in the United States or in Europe. They're fleecing basically the Indian consumer, and they are still not competitive. Anytime there is the smallest decline in the domestic demand for automobiles, do something for me, otherwise the whole industry will collapse. Or employment, 10,000 workers will get unemployed. So when going is good, fine, I sell, make all my profits and so forth. And when the going gets tough, even in the domestic market, then I go and say, let the taxpayer foot my bill, because otherwise workers will. I mean, for 1 quarter, 2 quarters, you're going to fire off all your workers. And anyway, what is your labor cost? Less than 4% of your total costs are labor costs. So you see, I mean, when you begin to unpack these things, you begin to see that we have done. I mean, we have improved our policies a great bit since 1991. There's no doubt. And we have reaped benefits, by the way, So also, remember, 91, we were even much smaller. I mean, our industry was nothing. But we finally dismantled, we liberalized. By 2007, our top tariff rates, with some exceptions like auto and textiles, clothing, etc., those remain protected. But as far as the other tariffs are concerned, by 2007, we had brought them down to about 10%. And so, if you take the period from 2003 to 2011, 9-year period, exports went up, just merchandise exports went up from 50 billion to 300 billion, 6-fold. And services exports rose even faster. Go back to 94 or 95, there is hardly any IT industry exports there, hardly any. And now it's today more than $100 billion worth. So you see, with good policies, good things can happen. But we have to learn from our successes, not from our failures. Sometimes when we go back to this import substitution, we are learning from our failures, not from our successes. So go ahead.
I think there was a lot of good points there. I have a couple of very quick follow-ups, one on the import substitution and one excellent point that you made in the book on the currency. Yeah. But very quickly, because Rajiv also has a question, and then we have audience questions from Kushal also. So I fully agree that if you kind of commit like WTO China 2001, then you have to backward solve other problems.
Yes.
Like that thing you cannot touch. That's one way that's an aggressive and optimistic way of thinking about things. My point, like very quickly, for example, on just a couple of points on the import substitution, one thing that I think you will agree is that even if there is some moderate tariffs, so like you were mentioning, bring it back to 7% uniform tariff in the book, at least bring it to 10%. Don't tinker around with it, even if you need some tariffs. But we would say that we have full FDI across sectors. We don't have any investment licensing anymore. We don't have any permit quota raj. So even if we do have, we went from like 100% to 5%, and if we go back to say weighted average 7 or 10%, and that might be good or bad as we are discussing, but it is not the same as 50, 60, 70s in Nehruvian license raj, right? Because even in automakers, all our biggest automakers are foreign guys, Korean or Japanese. So it's not like Hindustan Motors got mollycoddled. And in fact, for example, not right now, not earlier, right now it's Hyundai, Maruti. These are the biggest manufacturers in India. And Motherson, Sumi are like massive auto component export manufacturers. So maybe there is something to be said about not infant industry, but it's simply about agglomeration. Like, Sanand had a factory, Tamil Nadu had a factory, and therefore all the auto component guys went around it. Mamata Banerjee missed it in Bengal, and therefore Bengal missed it, period. Similarly at the national level. So one point on the import substitution is not, it's even if we go back a bit, it's not the same as domestic no longer being free markets. And I think the second point, which you made, which is an excellent point just before this trade discussion in your book, because see, if I'm an entrepreneur, what are my costs? One cost is the taxes, direct or indirect, corporate. That has gone to 25%. GST taxes, we can disagree, agree, has come down.
In fact, it's actually even lower than 25, right? 17% now.
So for new manufacturing, it's actually 17%. So one is taxes. Second is cost of labor. Labor reforms you've discussed. Land reforms you've discussed. Third is cost of capital that we are doing with RBI. But a big cost which people don't realize, and people like you obviously understand very, very well, is what is the rupee dollar right now, right? Because one thing which you mentioned very well right now is that we actually saw a big boom in exports because from 90s to mid 2000s, the rupee went from 20 to 46.
Yeah.
And therefore, despite not having tariffs, we saw a boom. And what happened in 2017, before Governor Das took, when Governor Patel was in charge, the rupee suddenly appreciated. We had this silly idea of no volatility. We want to minimize volatility. We're not targeting any real rupee level, etc., etc. And what happened is when that started hurting the industry, policymakers started going through a second or third best tariff mechanism. Maybe the tariffs would never have come back if the RBI had been better with the currency management in the first place. But once that pain was there, and took time to get a new RBI governor, more understanding, and now we have record high forex reserves despite COVID crisis. So right now, maybe we are at a better situation than we were in 2017. Taxes are low, the rupee is more rational, so on and so forth. But the danger remains that if that is not properly done. So my point is there are many, many angles, and tariffs is only one aspect of whether an entrepreneur chooses. And the final point is there's something to be said about the domestic market size, right? I mean, Singapore and Hong Kong have to go for free trade. They're like city-state entrepôts. I'm not saying we are big enough. We're only 3% of the GDP. But if we do like the small tariffs for Samsung to massively build phones or even assemble initially in Noida, they are actually now exporting from there, and they've stopped all manufacturing in China. So the Chinese companies are different, but I'm talking only about Samsung. So maybe there is something to be said about partial monopsony power. But I broadly agree with your point. I just think that there are other factors like rupee, currency, taxes, which also have to get along. And maybe this was a partial amelioration at best. So long as it does not become an addiction, maybe it is manageable. What would you say to that?
Yeah, I mean, I would, I fear that often this doesn't remain partial, and small successes you produce lead you to do more of the same mistake. That's one point. And the other, of course, is that when you do in excess, which is what you did actually with auto industry, my friend. I mean, 125% tariff on the back of a complete ban on imports till 1991. Till 1991, the industry was completely protected with licenses and with the no imports permitted. There are stories in those days, in my young days, of somebody importing part by part the entire Mercedes and then putting it back inside Indian border. So this is, it became profitable to do those kinds of things. We were so bad. But with 125% tariffs, you are right that investment has happened, but they've all put up very small plants. These are highly inefficient plants. So this is why they are not able to compete. I mean, when Toyota has set up plants and GM sets up plants and Fiat, Ford sets up plants, why doesn't it use those plants to export? I mean, it's only because now Ford is exporting. No, I know Ford is exporting a bit.
GM is also.
Huh?
In fact, GM is not selling in India; it's only exporting.
No, because they couldn't compete in the end. Maruti, etc., really outcompeted them, so they are. But they are small plants. They are never going to become large exporters from India. I mean, China is producing 20 million cars a year. We are finally, after 30 years, 91 to 30 years.
If I may interject, Professor.
Yeah, Rajiv.
So why is that size or export issue there? Is it because of the protection, or is it because of other factor market issues, such as labor?
No. Why are they coming into the domestic market? Because there is 125% tariff. See, the point is that that if the tariff was only 5% or 10%, then because of the factor market issues, they would never come into the country.
Yes.
So they came into the country. But don't forget, they are diverting my capital to this very highly capital intensive industry. I mean, it's not like if the auto industry didn't come into India, there will be no other industry. What we have done really, think from the capital point of view. What have we done? Very capital scarce country. We are a labor abundant country, right? I mean, 500 million workers. We are not a capital abundant country. US is capital abundant, and because the interest rate, look what has happened, zero, and still market is not clearing. So that's a capital abundant country. We are a capital scarce country. Why are we tying up our capital? Petroleum refining, most capital intensive industry. Auto, most capital intensive industry. Machinery sector, engineering goods industries, chemicals. These are all capital intensive industries that starves my textile industry, clothing industry of the capital. So they have to pay very high interest rates for the capital that they borrow from the banks, or they have to borrow probably from the NBFCs and others which charge exorbitant rates. So your strategy ought to be to spread your capital over a very labor-intensive kind of set of industries, so that you create a lot of very good jobs for the masses. I mean, what jobs is petroleum refining creating? Nothing. Everything is automated. The same goes for auto industry. 4% of the labor costs are 4% of the costs are labor costs. So that's the point. So both. I mean, what happens is, and this is a long recognized point, that you give an industry protection, and of course it flourishes, and we say, look, it succeeded. But what then economists see and others don't is the fact that so many other industries which would have flourished did not flourish. So that
this is Bastiat, what you see and what you don't see. Frederick Bastiat.
Yeah.
Rajiv, you had a question. Yeah. So that was a really interesting discussion on trade, and now I wanted to ask Professor on higher education.
Yes.
So in the book, obviously in India Unlimited, the book, you have a fantastic playbook for how reforms should be carried out in the sector. And you've obviously very well highlighted the productivity issues, the kind of dismal output we have in terms of innovation, in terms of patents and so on. And then we also have one example recently, actually. So last year, the National Medical Commission came into being.
Yes.
And you obviously had played a major role when you were at Niti Aayog,
right,
in driving that reform. So what lessons can we draw for higher education? I think some of it you do touch upon in the book, but is that model generalizable for higher education, for professional education? And the second part of my question is, another phenomenon we see in India is that we have what I like to call a remittance mindset.
Mm-hmm.
So that is, India kind of almost takes pride in exporting its human capital either to more hospitable climes abroad, or we also have a very thriving captive research center of global multinational corporations. So the whole kind of debate between should we keep doing that, the cream of our capital works either outside India, sends back remittances, and that's amounting to about 70 billion a year, versus knowledge creation at home. So at what point, I mean, in a kind of macroeconomic development standpoint, at what point can India make the transition where we emphasize the knowledge creation part? Obviously, the remittance has served us well because, when we were a much smaller economy, there were no opportunities at home for that kind of talent. That remittance approach worked very well for us. But do you think there is a case for transitioning into more knowledge-intensive work in India for Indian industry?
Right. So I think Rajiv misspoke. You meant that what we were doing was sending labor out, and they are sending the remittances. I think that's what.
I was saying that we send human capital.
Human capital.
And obviously those people are we are agglomerating about 70 billion a year in remittances.
Right. Yeah. No. So remember that a lot of the remittances actually are coming from the Middle East.
Yeah.
And a lot of your serious human capital is probably in the United States.
Yeah.
Which probably, we don't know the disaggregated data. So, but my gut feeling is that remittances from the United States are more limited. So what, in terms of human capital that we are exporting, I don't think even remittances, we are getting returns in terms of remittances big time.
No, but in terms of the mindset, that
Yeah,
that
right.
even the government seems to have a mindset, right? Like often our government is kind of negotiating for H-1B visas,
Right.
or
I mean,
other kinds of economies
Yeah.
for our workers.
Yeah. I mean, on that one, I'll say actually, I mean, you have written a very nice piece on this, right? So,
Yes.
and I thought that was a brilliant piece, where I don't know, may have been co-authored with Harsh, so I've forgotten, but I remember that you said, why don't we let good workers from China and from Indonesia and from everywhere else come and work here in Bangalore or in Hyderabad? I think that's a splendid idea, so we should certainly do that. And H-1B visa, actually, in a way, I find that we have used it to stall all our negotiations with the trading partners. I mean, I felt that very much, that we, whenever it comes to negotiating RCEP or negotiating European Union and so forth, we go and allow my workers to come to your country to do the jobs and all. And then, of course, it gets into immigration issues. Countries are not willing to open their borders like that, and so the whole negotiation actually ends right there before it even begins. So that has been very counterproductive in a very different sense, not in the sense in which you were asking the question, but in a different sense, it has been extremely counterproductive. Actually, we have not let any agreements move forward at all because of that insistence. And I don't think that's a productive, healthy insistence, because it will not happen and will then give up on all the rest of the agreement. So, but okay, but to your central question, at the end of the day, first of all, what one needs to do is to do something about the higher education system. One needs to do something about the research, R&D. What are we doing? I mean, look, we probably were doing more serious research in the 60s and 70s. In some areas, we continue, I mean, theorists can flourish anywhere, in physics or mathematics or something. Occasionally, you'll get some brilliant people, but that has nothing to do with our system. It's simply those particular individuals who are doing it. But wherever the effect of agglomeration, meaning that scholars working in an area being in the same place at the same time, that is most important. That's agglomeration of ideas. That's very critical. There we have done nothing. We rank so poorly. Hardly there's no single Indian institution that ranks even in the top 100. China has at least 2, probably more. In fact, there are 2, Tsinghua and Peking, which are both in the top 25. If you do QS rankings or THE ranking, so we haven't done it, and so we basically have been filtering system. Our top educational institutions like the IITs and IIMs have been a fantastic filtering systems. They take out the talent, do some nurturing in terms of teaching, but not research really, and then we export them. But even when we do that, they first get educated for another 2 to 4 years in the United States, and then they become big successes. But we are a big country, huge country. We need our own institutions to produce good outcomes. And so that is this is why I wrote a very long chapter, actually. I didn't even talk about school education in this book, because again, I felt that, higher education is what really needs fixing big time. And a lot of our talent is going, either abroad or gets wasted. That's not what we want, So we very much need that reform. The medical reform that you mentioned actually provides a good template also. But somebody in HRD ministry needs to sit down and write that legislation. I think the Prime Minister will support it. I mean, I saw this. I got full support from the Prime Minister on the National Medical Commission Act. In fact, but for its support, the bill would not have come to in the form that it has come out. And I think the same thing can be done. And when I wrote out this chapter in which I outline in great detail how we could reform. I used that template. I also studied the Chinese, American, and British systems, and I draw quite a bit on the latest
different systems and the approaches there and what we can learn and so on.
Yeah, and I particularly draw quite a bit on that, on the latest UK reform. I think for our kind of system, the latest UK reform provides a good template. And so that's what I advocate. With some modifications for the Indian conditions and all. But we need to urgently do that. And the other thing is, building up some universities of excellence. And there our debate, got mired into all this other stuff when the Reliance University or Institute got, or Geo Institute got included as an institution of excellence or something, this doesn't even exist. How can it be an institution of excellence? Maybe the label was wrong, but I think the idea was right, because, evaluate the proposals for new institutions, and then give them the autonomy. I mean, to me, that label of excellence is not about giving money or anything. It is about giving them full autonomy to do what the universities in the United Kingdom, China, and the United States are able to do. Give them full autonomy. Free them of this University Grants Commission stuff and all. That is what you need to do. And a new university, when it is starting, can write the rules from scratch. It hires its faculty from scratch. So it can build into the ideas that, look, faculty members who are more productive will be rewarded at a higher rate than those who are not being productive. Today, if you want to change to that kind of regime in IITs, probably most of the faculties will refuse. They will not agree to that kind of change, because they now want everybody to get the same salary. And that, of course, makes it very hard. Even if you want to bring somebody from outside, you can't bring them to the Indian shores at those salaries. You have to give them, so in the new institutions, you can do that. Which is why I thought the decision actually to put the Geo Institute in that category was the right decision. And we ought to do more.
There's a lot of wrong information about it. Was a greenfield category, right? So obviously it would be a new institution by default, by the plain logic of it.
Absolutely. But because the label was such that, an institution that doesn't even exist, how can it be an institution of excellence? Right. So that is where you see. So we need to, and in India, everything becomes very political, So somehow, because it's a particular industry related, and therefore it has to be, but that is not how the institution ought to be evaluated. We have to evaluate whether it's in national interest. Is it going to help the Indian education system? That's how we ought to look at these things. So that's the sort of, but we need, and I'm really glad you asked me this question, because that's a chapter which seems to get neglected, unfortunately. But that is to me, that was one of the very important, as important as the labor law related chapter. That we need to fix that.
Coming from the field of technology and entrepreneurship, as an investor, I can totally appreciate the importance and criticality of this for seeing India grow to a 5 trillion economy and beyond.
Absolutely, yeah. And we should really think, in 15 years, we should think more like 20, not 20, but at least 10 to 12 trillion, where China is today. In 20 years, we ought to be where China is today, at least, in real terms.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and so that's where the higher education reform is long awaited, very critical. And we need to bring, by the way, a very important thing, which I argue in the book, is that bring research centrally to the universities. What we have done is to separate research in the councils.
Absolutely. That was probably in my view, even I've sort of, I share your view completely, Professor, that it was probably a kind of a mistake in some ways to completely disaggregate.
Yeah, because you see, once I came to America, then I began to appreciate this, because you see the students at the PhD level, it's the students who ask the tough questions from the faculty, and it's many times it's the questions of the students that lead the faculty to then go back to the drawing board and see, what is the answer. So, and the young minds always, ask you questions from very different angles and so forth. And likewise, the young minds also need to be fed back by the more senior faculty on these research. I mean, the training has to come from the senior faculty who had been doing it for the last 20 years or 15 years and so forth. So there is a perfect symbiotic relationship here that, it benefits the students, benefits the faculty. And very quickly, the students grow to be the faculty. I mean, and they do the frontiers research. I mean, Paul Samuelson, for example, always used to say that, look, the research, science belongs to the young. I mean, he would say that science belongs to the young. And it really, the force of that point, you see in the United States, that now I'm sort of, in my mid-60s. And so the really frontiers research is being done by the youngsters, not me. But when I was younger, I did the same. Mr. Bhagwati was one of my models, He was a powerhouse of research in his young days.
And even the interdisciplinary nature of work,
right?
Where different fields intersect together in a larger university.
Let me correct the terminology. Use multidisciplinary, not interdisciplinary. Interdisciplinary brings in a lot of mediocrity into the system. Multidisciplinary means that the scholars from different disciplines, top scholars from different disciplines come in to collaborate. So, like Kahneman, who was from psychology and won the Economics Nobel Prize, right? So we do cross-fertilization. Interdisciplinary.
Nash being a mathematician.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Whereas when we say interdisciplinary, a lot of mediocre stuff gets in there. That I'm going to work in the intersection of this, and this, and so interdisciplinary. But often that brings in more mediocre thinking.
Fair enough, understood.
All right, so Dr. Panagariya, now I wanted to ask you a few questions. Very interesting. So one of this question is about the education system. So somebody in our live audiences has asked, sir, can we have an education system where when we teach economics, we also factor in things like sociocultural realities of each individual country? At least when I grew up studying in our school system in India, when they used to teach us economics, they actually did not even have a variable called cultural realities in their calculation, and they would not even teach something like that to us. So where do you think, how does one actually create a very objective standards when we factor in socio-cultural realities into economic models?
Yeah, I mean, I think economics is in America, we are not factoring in any socio-cultural reality into this curriculum. What is important is the context. I mean, in America, when we teach the students, the examples, the context is American. What we have not done in India is to do the books for the students that cast the analysis in the Indian context. We simply translate the textbooks that are taught elsewhere, or basically, take out of them and write our own based on those, and that's how we teach. But that's not the way. I think there's a lot of context and sort of, some of the economics that I'm writing on India. I mean, it's not the kind of microeconomics or macroeconomics that I'm writing, but there are huge elements of that, and there is all of it is India context. So that is, I think, what you need to do. I mean, I would still say that for good economics, one has to teach. I mean, economics is a little bit different field also, in the sense that, we don't teach it by regions, for example, China, India, there is no regional specialization. I am a little bit of an aberration in this sense that I have a bit of an India specialization. But, we teach macroeconomics, we teach microeconomics, we teach public finance, international trade, and so forth. So those fields we have to teach them on the frontiers in the way that the rest of the world teaches, but the context ought to be Indian, right? What is the macroeconomic issues when we talk about inflation targeting, when we talk about monetary stabilization, when we talk about fiscal discipline, what is it in the Indian context? We can broaden it to say emerging markets context, which may be different also. So I think I would worry a lot more about the context, contextualize, because economics in this ultimate is, some parts of economics are very abstract and theory and so forth, which is fine. That also needs to be done. But large part of it is applied science. I mean, to me, and which is why I eventually, as I grew older and older, I really kind of began to apply a hell of a lot more. And these days, all the writing I do is really applied writing completely. I mean, if you go back 20 years of my career, so, from starting from late 70s, first 30 years, you'll not recognize who that Arvind Panagaria is. It's a totally different, it's a totally different life. But I also recognize, and my own field, which was international trade, ultimately is an applied field. And I was very influenced, obviously, also by Jagdish Bhagwati's work. So there's a lot of overlap in the kinds of things he does, and the evolution also is very similar. He also was theorist purely, and then began also a very applied theorist. So I think economics as a whole is an applied science, and therefore it has to be applied to country. And so if we are teaching it in India, we have to apply it to India. And that context ought to be, we took, for example, issues of environment. What is the Indian context, right? We tend to transplant the Western context. So we talk only about global warming predominantly. But for us, I think the real serious problem is the Indian cities, local pollution. I mean, yeah. I come to the global warming issue in the Indian context from the local pollution angle. That is what I would target. In a global context, we are not such a large polluter. When you look at the heavy hitters like the United States, Europe, and China, we are, compared to those guys, we are relatively small for a population of 1.37 billion. But our cities, you look at the top 10 most polluted cities, 9 are in India. I mean, I was astounded. A city like Gaya is among the top 10 polluters worldwide.
Yeah.
I mean, not polluters. I mean, it's the level of pollution in the city.
Yeah.
So there, I think, so that's the kind of context we need to introduce into the teaching, and then the students will naturally, the social culture they will pick up. I mean, that's where you grow. I mean, at the end of the day, I left India at the age of about 21 plus years. By that time, my basic personality was already set, and my citizenship and everything was Indian, it doesn't really change. You carry that with you. So even when I came to Niti Aayog, I'd gone to Hindi school, luckily, it worked out to my advantage. So I could give a lot of interviews in Hindi. And sometimes the interviewers will stop in the midway and will ask me, "Aapki Hindi itni achhi kyun hai?"
Yeah.
So those are things people will pick up. I mean, it's like I also say, in when we bring up children, many things parents don't need to tell the children. Children watch the parents very closely. So if the children, if they see that the parents value honesty, parents value being truthful, they automatically pick those attributes. You don't have to sit down and tell them that, hey, son, always speak truth, always, be honest, etc. Occasionally you might say, but most of the time, I think, children pick up from the parents just by observing them. And so when you grow up in the system, I think social culture you will pick up. So for economics, I'm talking economics education. I would give them the state-of-the-art economics education with the Indian context, but social-cultural are on the side for economics. For science, for history, it's a different issue. For sociology, it's a different issue, and so forth.
All right, sir. Karan has asked this question. Does the inverted tax structure where larger companies are taxed higher and smaller companies get tax benefits, does this disincentivize companies from growing bigger?
It will disincentivize, no doubt. Yes. Which is why I think, recently, for example, I'll take a very specific context, for instance. The finance minister sort of rightly pushed it in the right direction, for micro, small, and medium firms. She said, I'm going to change the definitions and make it a bit more liberal in each category. So if I forget what the limits were, if the investment limits were, let's say 1 crore for micro, I'll raise that to 3 crore, so that the firms which are 1 crore will grow to 3 crore. My take on that one was that she should have gone a little farther, should have actually clubbed micro and small. No need to make a distinction between those categories. Make micro and small the same, and let the benefits of micro apply to all small. If there is a political issue that you can't really reduce the benefits to micro by calling them small or merging them with small, well, in that case, I'll merge the small with micro and then give whatever benefits are there for micro, give to all small. Now, I can understand that you want to have some distinction between the small and, let's say, medium and large, because often the small entrepreneurs have very difficulty getting, great difficulty getting access to credit in the formal credit market. So they are a bit disadvantaged there. Either ideal thing would be that you somehow take care of their financial access to finance as well, but you can't then perhaps some bit of distinction could be, but it shouldn't be too large. You see, the whole problem is, and also you can do continuum, right? That if there is a continuum, that you have the graded structure, so that you go from one category to the other, and then you get unified at medium or large. So that's the sort of thing we ought to do. Even maybe eliminate medium and just small and medium and large. You can just have those two categories and clean it up. That will go a much longer way towards sort of removing this disincentive kind of effect.
All right. So I think this one was answered previously, but I'll still ask the question if you want to add something. Siddharth Ravi Kumar has asked, I've heard that scaling up in textile and competing with Bangladesh in cheap labor is not feasible in India because of the abuse of the labor that Bangladesh permits, and that just won't fly in India at scale. Is this true? So I think we've pretty much covered it. Do you want to add something to it, sir?
Yeah, but this is an age-old argument they keep giving, I mean, if on Bangladesh, a lot of these companies are actually exporting, and they can't export here unless they do some kind of bit of certification of the treatment of the workers. They need to check, it is very easy to microscopically, just go in and find abuse somewhere. And do you think I can show you a lot of abuse in Indian industry as well? So it's not that factor that is leading to what, and forget Bangladesh. What about China? China has very high wages. China has no access to meaning has no free trade agreement with either Europe or the United States. It has no other tariff concessions either. China is your largest exporter of clothing.
Yeah.
So what about that? Why can't we? So forget it. So don't compete. If you don't want to compete against Bangladesh, don't. Why don't you compete against China straight?
Yeah. Yep, I agree. So, sir, Apurva has a very specific question here. So he asks, can the government acquire land from small landholders and in return give them flats in multi-storied apartments built under an Awas Yojana? Land evacuated could be used for industries. I think what Apurva is hinting at has already been tried in my experience in Mumbai, which is Dharavi, which has failed miserably because of political reasons.
Yeah, see, why do we want to do this linking and all? My take on this is, and this is particularly on the periphery of the large cities, or even mid-sized smaller cities also, that's where a lot of the agricultural land can become very useful for urbanization, right? So allow automatic conversion to the farmer from agriculture to non-agriculture. Any farmer who says my farm is less than half hectare, I can hardly farm on it, allow me to convert it to, once the conversion happens, the price will become very attractive for the farmer, and allow the farmer to sell that. Then the farmer will decide wherever he or she wants to buy a flat, they will go and buy a flat there. See, the Dharavi issue was a different one because this is a question being asked from the viewpoint of the farmer. Dharbi was our problem, which is that here are slums. How do I clean that up? And that is where, the idea was that, look, build alternative housing, rehabilitate or relocate them into a different apartment, and then get that land from the resident. That's a more complicated problem, but the one for the farmer is a lot easier one. I mean, I think recently I read that Karnataka has actually, or is amending the Land Reform Act, which would then permit the farmers to convert land to non-farm or non-agricultural use, and then they can sell it off at a lucrative price. So I think that's a far easier solution. And because then the farmer can use do with the money whatever the farmer wants to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So this is it's a question. I think this is a question perfect for a professor. So again, Siddharth asks, I would love to know Dr. Panagaria's objection to the infant industry protection argument by Ha-Joon Chang.
Yeah. It's not one objection. There's multiple objections. So he has to do the hard work in this case. He has to read the very long chapter on infant industry protection in my book called Free Trade and Prosperity. There is actually there is an Indian version of, meaning there's an Indian print brought out by Oxford University Press. He would get, and I deal with everybody: Ha-Joon Chang, Danny Roderick, Alice Hemsden, everybody I deal with all of them. Theirs. I will take one of Ha-Joon Chang's, which I thought was funny. So one argument Ha-Joon Chang gives there is that, well, I never ask my child, we never ask our children to go and work. We protect them, right? And so asking the new companies to compete against these imports is equivalent to sort of asking the child to go and work. Now, that's a very sort of insidious analogy, because we don't discriminate when we protect the children. Whatever the child is, whether there is any disability, inability, whatever, regardless, we protect them. We send them all to schools and so forth. Infant industry protection is about selective protection. You're choosing. Plus, we don't think of foreign competition versus domestic or anything in protecting the children. In this case, if Ha-Joon Chang's argument is to apply, then every little new firm that comes in must be protected, because if every child is protected, every company should be protected. It doesn't matter whether there is foreign competition or not. It still has to compete against the domestic companies. So, these are very insidious kind of arguments made, which kind of made to look like very plausible. Yeah, we don't ask the children to do so. Why, we should protect the little firms also. But there is no parallel here. It's completely fake parallel being drawn. So that's
Professor. Just one quick point on that. There is a very good friend and colleague of yours, I believe, Douglas Irwin.
Yes.
Professor of trade.
It's prolific. Yeah.
He also.
Yeah.
Yes. He's very prolific. He's just come out with a new book, Clash Over Commerce, I think, something like that, about the history of US trade policy. So when a lot of people say that, for example, US had 40% weighted average import tariffs on manufacturing imports.
Yeah,
the
second
19th century.
Yeah.
Especially post-Civil War till First World War, or till the Great Depression. Those kind of arguments, because I think people like you and Danny Roderick agree on that currency should be real depreciated, right? But on this other point of maybe not industrial policy but trade policy, based on the history, what would you say?
Yeah. So your professor himself wrote about this.
Yes, I know.
And he wrote about this when reviewing Ha-Joon Chang's book.
Right. And he wrote about Hamilton, Alexander Hamilton, and all that.
He wrote about that too. But his answer to Ha-Joon Chang on this second half of the 19th century was that that America during that period pursued a lot of very, very good policies. Its
Right.
domestic market was large, it built up the infrastructure, and the competition in the domestic economy was completely rampant.
Yes.
So that helped the American economy grow in a very big way. But it also, quite rightly, sort of, it also protected. But that doesn't mean that it would have grown any less if it had free trade. His argument is that probably it would have added another percentage or 2% to growth had it been also open.
Yeah, we can't do counterfactuals, right? That's
So,
right.
yeah. So just because that American economy performed well during that period doesn't mean that protection actually was good. So that is Doug's answer to Ha-Joon Chang and you.
All right. So one more question. I'm actually quite amazed. The quality of the questions on the live chat are very good. So again, somebody has asked, they want to know your thoughts on Richard Werner and his arguments about the role of central banks and how interest rates have no effect on the economy while quantum of credit creation does.
Okay, this I will have to pass. This is a very macro question. So I'm going to pass. This is
all right. So let me take one more question then. This is related to the American economy. So Anant has asked, with the Fed going for quarter infinity, what will be the impact on the US dollar and the US economy? Will we see a reset of the global monetary system, and what would be the impact on India? So eventually is concerned about the impact on India.
Yeah, you see that this is why. So I'll just say, plug in some thought here. That smaller economies, once they open up to these very massive capital flows fully, they tend to be vulnerable, to the what happens in the larger economies, because capital moves at absolutely astonishing speed. So anytime interest rates rise in the United States, capital bang moves out. And this is why, normally I don't believe we write a lot of scientific papers about sequencing of reforms, etc., etc. But for a practical matter, I generally say that, politically these things are so difficult. Don't worry so much about sequencing. Just whatever you can do, go ahead, do it. And eventually the sequencing will sort itself out, because otherwise you'll never get done if you are waiting for the best sequencing. For this one particular issue of capital mobility, I'm conservative that's one thing I would put on the back of the queue. That's one thing, and simply because you see these massive flows can cause crises. We saw some play of this in August 2013 in India, when the US was on this very QE, the quantitative expansion of money, and then started talking about reversal of QE and tapering of the policy. And so there was a term that got used, taper tantrum. And so in India then had a massive kind of depreciation of the rupee at that time as a result, and all very large depreciation. And that sort of vulnerability sort of remains. So if and when the interest rates rise in the US again, right now they've gone to zero. Right now the interest rates are zero, but when they rise again, you will see this movement. So in that respect, I feel that India, has opened its financial capital. So it's really more to do with financial capital, which can move fast. Your direct foreign investment, portfolio investment, those are okay generally. It takes a while, and but financial capital moves very, very rapidly. So that's the one where I would be a little bit cautious. I think there India actually has gone a little too fast, in my opinion. I would have been a little slower on that one. But this is where the lot of the pressure also comes from the FIIs. Because you see, the interest rates are so high in India compared to what they are in the US. Plus, in addition, what happens is that at least for a while, we were also keeping rupee overvalued. We won't let the rupee depreciate.
Yeah.
And so then it is a clear certain big plus for them. They get the 4-5%, or at that time 7-8% interest rate on the government, which is fully assured, and no exchange rate risk. So whereas this 0% or 1% in the US economy, so they love it. So the FIIs were really keep always pushing for it. The government also sees that, well, they will come and buy my paper. And so the government also feels it's good for me. So we have done that, but I think it has a cost, because anytime interest rates rise back in the US, capital will move back out.
So, sir, two more questions very specific to India. So Ajinkya has asked, I don't know if you're aware of this. I'm certainly not, because it's happened today. Today, a proposal was submitted to the Prime Minister's office based on human resource model of economics by Deepak Sharma. It claims to increase the GDP to $15 trillion by 2025. Have you read? And if you have read it, do you have any comments on it?
Sorry, I've not read it, and I don't intend to read it. This is not serious. Serious.
So fair enough. So one last question, Dr. Panagaria. So Karan asks again, so from your experience, is the slow pace of reforms purely a bureaucratic problem, or is there not enough political push from the political class also in general in India?
Oh, you see, so political class, of course, matters most. If the political class doesn't want it, it won't happen. I mean, it's as simple as that. Till 1990, why did it not happen? Because political class really didn't want it. And bureaucrats were, of course, very happy with the status quo. So that was a perfect situation. Now, when the political class, so that's a necessary condition. Political class has to want it. Without it, you are not going to get reforms. I mean, some small reforms, maybe bureaucrats can slip in if they want to. I mean, that much leeway they got. But nothing major they can slip in, because it's all legislated and so forth. So, legislation you can't change without political will. So that's a necessary condition, that the politician at the top, so in the UPA period, clearly, obviously, no bureaucrat could have gotten big reforms done. It didn't happen, particularly UPA too. But, so that's a necessary condition. Now, when the political class want it and still doesn't happen, well, then the burden is on the bureaucracy, really.
All right, sir.
Now, some bureaucrats can also speed things up. I mean, so I'm very careful if you read the, so some of the stories that came out in the newspaper based on the book, only took one side and they didn't, but if you read the book, I'm careful to say that, there are some incredibly fantastic bureaucrats in the system who drive the process. Without which also things would move far, far slowly, and far less will be accomplished. I mean, there are bureaucrats who make a common cause with the politicians. I mean, we know that, Narasimha Rao and Dr. Manmohan Singh, when they were doing the reforms, there were some very enlightened bureaucrats. We had Naresh Chandra, we had Verma, of course, A.N. Verma. Very enlightened. So they really played a critical role in pushing these things and systematically moved the bureaucracy too. But at the same time, there are many bureaucrats who sit as secretaries in many other ministries where they can slow down. And that I also explain how they slow it down. It's not rocket science.
Yeah. So before we wrap things up, sir, so just one last question. So what's up now that the book is done? What is the next project that we can look forward to from your end?
We will see. I think, I'm just, as my last thing, I've just finished actually the US version of this book, which is not different, but one has to do all, the Oxford University Press in New York is going to bring it out. So the final proofreading is still not done. So we'll do that. And I'm just thinking about, 2 or 3 different possibilities, what I will do next. But truthfully, I don't know the answer myself, actually, what will that be? So that's where right now it's completely, you have caught me in the middle of it.
That's fair enough. So, guys, I think we've taken a lot of time of Dr. Panagaria. So, before we wrap things up, I would like to tell you guys that please buy the book. I think this book is a must-read for each and every person who's interested in the Indian economic story, what ails India, what we could do to fix things in India. You see Harsh picking up the copy of the book on the screen. If you want to buy the book, I have already put the link of the book in the description of the podcast. All you need to go is look at the description, click the link, and buy the book. And not only should you buy the book, you should make at least 5 to 10 more people buy this book and discuss the damn book. That's how you're supposed to do it. We need to get this habit of reading books and discussing them. So on that note, once again, Dr. Panagaria, thanks a lot for coming on the podcast. It is an absolute honor to host you. And also thanks a lot to Harsh and Rajiv for being kind enough to join me in this discussion and actually increasing the level, because I'm a novice when it comes to economics. So, it was really nice of Harsh and Rajiv. So thanks to all three of you.
Thank you, Kushal, for hosting it. Thank you, Harsh, for joining. Thank you, Rajiv, for joining. I think we got pretty good roundtable discussion today. I thought a lot of excellent questions came, and thanks to the audience also. By the way, they asked very, very good questions. And so my apologies to the one I couldn't answer, but that was simply I just couldn't answer.
So, guys, it's time to wrap things up. You know where to find me. If you like what I'm doing over here, subscribe to the podcast, share the videos, like the videos. If you want to join the membership program on YouTube, click the join button. There are different tiers you can join it. If you don't want to become a member on YouTube, you have the option on Patreon. You know what I do on Patreon. We are already finishing tomorrow, Sunday. We're going to be finishing 4 books. 2020. The focus is RN invasion, RN migration, and out of India theory. We're going to complete all the books and papers on it. We're going to look at the pro and the anti sides. So by the end of it, you'll know everything you need to know about the subject. And until that, I'll see you next time. Namaste. Take care. Goodbye. See you next time.